Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mobilizing Demographic Data. It's a pleasure to be your moderator today. My name is Dr. Sara Diamond, and this is, of course, part of Data Ecoculture. And we are very happy to look at this event as a way to really strengthen our international and Canadian capacity to use data in smart ways to build audiences. So although we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands, which we all call home. From coast to coast in Canada, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of the Inuit, the Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I am in Toronto right now, and we're in the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, but also in a city that is a major gathering place for Indigenous people from all over Canada, including Métis and Inuit. We acknowledge these people and the lands to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Please join me to acknowledge the values, perspectives, languages, and cultures which can guide and inspire us, the role of Indigenous people as guardians and stewards of the lands, and to consider how we each can, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So I want to just give you a little bit of an overview on how this session will work. Our topic today is looking at the ways that governments and other kinds of data collecting agencies and analysts have opportunities for us. And of course, our speakers come from a range of different contexts. They'll share their insights and approach to demographic public data. We hope that you'll gain some insights into the usefulness of sociodemographic data and its sources, and also see how public data has been used to deepen audience knowledge, including issues around race, immigration, gender data, health, and wellness. So we have a live transcriber for this session. Please select your language, French or English, by clicking on the options on the top of the video screen. Our panel is in English today, but there is French translation. Do join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #DataEcoCulture. The session is recorded and will be retransmitted. If you do not agree to appear on the recording, please turn off your camera. So the way that we're going to move forward is we've got 3 speakers. I'm about to introduce them now. They'll each speak for about maybe 5 to 8 minutes. Then we'll have a chance for some interaction, some questions from me. And also do remember that you can join us with ideas in the chat. So I will now introduce our speakers in order of presentation. Marke Ambard is the Acting Director at the Policy Research Group at the Department of Canadian Heritage. His teams focus on economic and social impact measurements of the arts, culture, heritage, and sports sectors, as well as the measurement of other social questions, diversity and inclusion, well-being, social cohesion, a sense of belonging, and more. Marke also leads the data visualization team. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with him in that context, and as such, spends a great deal of time thinking about how to communicate and complex findings in accessible products. After Marke, we'll hear from Kelly Hill, who is the president of Hill Strategies Research. Kelly is a cultural sector researcher who is interested in furthering knowledge, discussion, and understanding of the arts and culture in Canadian society and beyond. Since founding Hill Strategies in 2002, Kelly has prepared over 400 research reports and presentations on the arts and culture, giving him a unique perspective on the Canadian cultural sector and culture-related statistics. And finally, we'll hear from Ted Hewitt, President of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Dr. Hewitt was appointed President of SSHRC in March of 2015. He served as the inaugural chair of the Canadian Research Coordinating Committee from 2017 to 2019. Ted was Vice President, Research and International Relations at Western University in London, Ontario, from 2004 to 2011, and he has been a professor of sociology since 1989. He also is a public policy scholar at the Brazil Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And he and I have had some great adventures in Brazil together over the years because we both like to collaborate a lot with Brazilian scholars. So we're now going to open the floor to the first presentation. Marke, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to do is I will just touch on kind of a few kind of key points that jump to mind when thinking about, the title of this session, Mobilizing Demographic Data. First of all, the Department of Canadian Heritage, where I work, has a lot of different program areas and a lot of different mandate areas. It's quite diverse internally. You may know that the Department of Canadian Heritage is, the Ministry of Culture, Arts, Heritage, but it's also the department where Sport Canada resides. We also have the Multiculturalism Group. We have the Indigenous Languages Program. We have the Official Languages Group that looks at official languages issues across the country. We have the LGBTQ2 Secretariat. We have the Youth Secretariat, and we have more and more. So this is important kind of grounding information for us because when my group, when the work that we do in the department, when we're looking at demographic data, it really depends why, what the context is, what the question is. If newspapers and periodicals, if that group has a need for demographic data or is looking at some of these questions, it's going to be very different than the approaches that they're using to collect the data or to analyze the data than would be the case for the multiculturalism group or even for the arts branch. So that's a pretty key point for us. There's a lot of things going on in the department, and where you are and what you're kind of looking at will really kind of, set the stage, so to speak. In the department as well, there's different kinds of main areas that we're looking at when we're looking at research questions and data questions. One is really just getting a sense of what's happening in Canadian society. What are the needs of Canadians? What are some of the trends, the issues, the beliefs, the values, the behaviors? And for us, that kind of level of research, it's important for policy development. It's important for program development, and even operation, just to make sure that the programs we're running or creating are still relevant. The approaches we're using, that they make sense in the given context of the day. So that's a big part of the research we do. There's also in the department a lot of focus that takes place in trying to understand if the diversity we see in Canadian society is also being represented in the voices we're hearing, in the cultural works that are being created, the artistic works that are being created and funded. How many Indigenous filmmakers do we have? How many women are writing books that are hitting the market. So there's a lot of work that kind of happens at that level. In a similar vein, there's work that happens just to understand who's applying for the funding at Canadian Heritage. We have a lot of programs. We give out a lot of funding to support these sectors. Who's applying and who's not applying? And likewise, who's being successful in their applications at actually receiving funding and who's not, and why? Are there barriers there that are, dissuading certain groups from accessing the funding, and what can we do about it to improve that? And then finally, probably one of the main areas we also look at is the impact of funding. So if we're giving funding to these different programs like festivals, what does that do to Canadian society? Does it contribute anything in terms of well-being, in terms of social cohesion, in terms of sense of belonging? What does it do to the Canadian economy? Those kinds of questions as well are very key. One thing I'll say globally for all of that is that none of it is easy, right? And I think that's why we're here today, is because these questions are hard. They're fascinating. They're extremely important. And we need to continually get better at what we're doing, improving our approaches, share, innovate, and keep moving forward in this area, because none of the measures we have do everything we want. And a lot of what we're trying to do is see what kind of proxies, what kind of new approaches we can take to get better and better at this. I think one other kind of main area I wanted to focus on is probably the last year or 2 years at the very least. A huge amount of our time is focused on the collecting of the demographic data and how hard that is. It's there's a focus for the government of Canada, as elsewhere, on diversity and inclusion, and so the demographic data is huge for us. It's a really key, component of what we need to be looking at. But, response burden is a big thing. People don't want to reply to surveys, so you have to get shorter and shorter. If you want to ask questions, you got to ask them better and better in more concise ways. And likewise, that means you have less kind of demographic variables you can get in the front end. But if you need those to be able to make sense of the data or to say who's faring better, who's faring worse, or where are issues, then that's a real tough balancing act. As well, with many of these kind of collection devices are quantitative devices, surveys, and you need your closed categories. And identity is a really tricky area. And sometimes those closed categories don't make sense for people, or people are coming with multiple identities and it could be different on one day than on another, or in a different context or in another. Certain terms don't please some people and please others. And so it's complex. It really is. The population group question at StatCan, the designated visible minority question, is one that we've been talking with them a lot for the last year or two about how they're thinking to improve that. They're currently, with funding from our department around the Canadian anti-racism strategy, have struck a expert committee to develop a diversity and inclusion framework for measurement. So we're curious to see how they will be adapting some of those questions. We have done tests over the last year to try to improve our questions, but we see from what we've done and what from other groups have done that, there's no perfect way to do these things, but it's still very important. The gender question as well is another one we've been spending a lot of time on. We recently ran the LGBTQ2 Action Plan survey for the Secretariat, which is in our department. And, the gender question was one that was really important. We went out with a closed set of questions, select one response, but we quickly got feedback that people wanted to be able to select that all that apply. So we changed that and we went back out into the field that way. But then what it does at the end of the day is it gives us categories or responses that maybe don't make 100% sense to the data analyst, looking at sex at birth and sexual orientation and gender. And so if that confusion comes into your recoding or your cleaning of the data, those kinds of questions are happening behind the scenes with the data analysis, who you don't want them making assumptions with the data, because we can't go back and ask those individuals what they meant when they were responding in certain ways. So trying to be really inclusive on the front end sometimes leads to some complexity behind the scenes. I'm not going to talk too much longer, maybe just to stress the fact that we spend a lot of our time in our group focused on data visualization, data storytelling. Everybody wants more and more data. There are a lot of stories in there. Nobody has time to look at all the data, so they want to know what the short answer is. And it's not an easy task either. And then probably the last thing I'll just mention before I hand it over, and we can talk more in the questions if there are, is in terms of qualitative data research, which is more and more something we're seeing we need. And there's more openness now in our department, in the Government of Canada writ large, to be open to that. With some of these questions, if we're talking about barriers to accessing arts funding for Indigenous communities, for example, those kind of questions you can't do in a quick fix on a survey. You need a much more elaborate kind of approach. More departments are going with, these national household surveys, a quantitative approach. And on the side, maybe a number of qualitative studies to be able to have meaningful discussions with different communities about issues that are important for them. And more, those processes are being run by the communities in ways where they set the parameters, set the kind of questions that will be asked and that they think are important for the discussions, et cetera. And all of that comes back into how we're going to use demographic data. There's a whole bunch of really interesting kind of parameters to this kind of thing. So I think I'll leave it there, and we can talk more in the discussion period, where I can share some of the examples of some concrete projects that we've done in the last little while, from the Culture Satellite account to a well-being app we've been creating with StatCan, to the social identity cycle at Statistics Canada, where we funded a large oversample. But I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Marke. Mark, I'm going to just ask you a couple of very brief clarification questions. That was a super overview. So to what extent does Heritage actually collect data itself versus relying on Stats Canada and other agencies? And for the data that you collect, how accessible is it?
how accessible is it to the Canadian public, do you mean?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah. Well, to different, and what are your thoughts on that? Just to maybe add that bit, and then we'll move on to other panels.
Okay. Well, really quickly, because there's different ways I can answer this, but we do collect data on our own as well. So we work very closely with Statistics Canada. My group does, and we develop projects together, and we will get data in that sense with Statistics Canada on certain questions. But the programs also collect their own data, or we also have a public opinion research group in our department, in my group, as a matter of fact, that will run surveys either with recipients and people who receive funding or have access to our programs, or contract external national level POR surveys as well through external contracts. And so that data does come in. We do have a number of different kinds of data sets in our department, and we are very active in terms of our commitment to open government. So as much as possible to share that data on the Open Government portal for the Government of Canada.
Great, thank you. Fantastic. So Kelly, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have a slide that I'm going to pull up and try to share.
Not quite there yet.
Is it there now, Sarah?
No, I'm not seeing it.
You're not seeing it? All right, let me try one more time. Share content. It didn't like me selecting it the first time. Share that window. It's not really allowing me to select the window that I want. Is it there now by any chance?
No, we're not seeing it. So maybe one of our technical folks could help. If you want to.
Are you able to scroll down a little bit to select the screen where you're?
I can see the screen when I try to share the content. It gives me the options at the bottom, but when I double click it to try to bring it up, it's just not bringing it up.
Okay, so they're looking into it on the technical side.
So I will start on my own, and hopefully we can get that going. I am Kelly Hill, president of Hill Strategies Research, a Canadian company that tries to produce data and qualitative analysis in the cultural sector specifically. We have a fully bilingual website at hillstrategies.com, and I started that company in 2002 to try to provide this kind of detailed information. So we've got, in the 20 years of our existence, we've done products that we started from the start, basically. The Arts Research Monitor, Statistical Insights on the Arts series, some presentations, and we do commissioned research projects as well. And I'm just going to try to share my screen again and see if that might happen to be working now. No, it's just not trying, not allowing me to select or double click that screen.
Yeah, I know the tech people are trying to kind of deal with it. So
yeah, I couldn't. Okay, so you'll give me a voice indication if they have got it. I saw a beep on the bottom. I didn't know if that meant it was clear, but no, obviously not. Okay, so I wanted to place my comments today in some context, and the context is fairly dire for a lot of us, a lot of the cultural sector, in a kind of general sense. The cultural sector has been extremely hard hit by the pandemic. Survival is a question mark for a lot of artists and cultural organizations. Some of the pre-pandemic issues of precarity and inequity have been exacerbated. That has led to high stress levels in the cultural community and beyond. But there are also very important issues of decolonization, where some of the most vulnerable artists and arts organizations are Indigenous. And we're just starting down the process of trying to understand better from our own work what might Indigenous self-determination or Indigenous data sovereignty even in the arts look like. And I wanted to recognize that in the cultural sector in Canada, there's a heightened precarity of Black artists and cultural workers, of people of color, of women in the arts and culture, and arts and cultural workers who are deaf and or have a disability. So what does that mean for us in terms of doing data? I think there are a number of issues, and Mark mentioned one that is very close to heart. It's that capturing people's identities, aka demographics, is really complex. We need to be very careful and thoughtful in survey creation. And on the analytical side, you need to dig deep to find insights. It's not just a superficial exercise of this many people said this. There's much more to it than the simplistic analysis that we might have done at times in the past, ourselves included. So the one of the things that we need to do is an intersectional analysis, and that is looking at multiple categories of individuals' identities, and not just looking at women versus men versus other genders, if that question is available and written in that way, and the different situations, but also looking at racialized women and non-racialized women and their different situations.
Kelly, can I interrupt you? And the tech team said if you wanted to take 1 second and just send them your slide deck, they would.
Yes, how do I do that?
How does he do that? I think if you just put it, in the chat. Okay. Can you send Kelly your email and he will do that in a second? It's there you go. It's in the chat, Kelly. Got it. Okay, thank you. So sorry to our listeners. We'll come back on track in just a moment. We're going to give Kelly a sec to do that. Marke, I'm going to ask you, you've heard some interesting things from Kelly around some of the challenges around the complexity of demographic data, and you gave us some good examples of how Heritage is trying to work with this, and then the chain around data cleansing, as things sort of move forward. Any comments from what you've heard from Kelly about, what you're seeing around precarity and risk within those communities? We'll give Veronica a moment to get the slides up.
Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything Kelly said so far. And I did have a point on intersectional analysis as well, which is really linked to our qualitative kind of research component, because we find there are so many limits with what we can do with the quantitative, although there are things we can and we are trying to do. But how he set the stage, I completely agree with what he's saying.
Great. Okay.
And it's a challenge. I'm sorry, I'm going to comment back in. The email is trying to get set now, so it's in the works. But it's also challenging. Like it's not easy to do to get to an intersectional analysis, because it does demand that we have large sample sizes. For example, that if we look intersectionally, to have reliable data at that level often requires some very large data sets. So I have emailed the file, just a note to the tech people and Sara, so that should be on its way. So it is challenging to do. It's not necessarily a straightforward thing, and there are lots of data sets and lots of analyses that we see all the time that don't pursue an intersectional analysis. And I think the simplest reason is that there's the data sets are not rich enough to allow for that, to allow for quality data at that level. So if we have a telephone survey or an internet survey of 1,000 Canadians or 2,000 Canadians even, that is good for an overall sample, but it's really not enough to delve into some detailed demographic kind of information, especially when we're talking about smaller percentages of populations.
Here's your slides. Okay, great. Good. So maybe just make your way through them, Veronique, and Kelly, maybe you can help her to. Yep. Okay, great. We'll try and
keep going. There we are. Thank you very much. Whoop. There we are. Yes, thank you. So in the current context, we could also afficher l'écran au complet si on va à l'affichage en haut à gauche. Oui, mode. C'est bon.
Perfect.
Merci.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not easy to do, and it's not obvious. Large sample sizes are one requirement, but also the analytical time and space and money to be able to do that is something that is very important. And I wanted to also mention that it touches on intersectional analysis, but also capturing people's identities, is that with a colleague, we actually wrote a literature review on inclusive practices on this, and as part of a larger survey project. Now, unfortunately, our client had decided to only publish the results of the survey itself and not the literature review, so I can't really speak to the details of that. But Mark, in your case, that might have, if you had had access to that, that might have helped you with the question of the multiple identities related to, it wasn't sexual identity, it was gender identity. And that was one thing that we found in the literature review that was quite clear for us. So that is one other item I wanted to mention. So in the current context, one of the other implications is that there's a particular relevance of trying to measure the health and mental health benefits of cultural activities. And we've done that, even though it's data set that is that predates the pandemic. Certainly, it has a certain relevance now because of people's the strained mental health situation for many people. But I think some of the challenges, some of the equity challenges that are very current today and very top of mind for many people, I think that's requiring us and asking us to do data differently, to at least think about doing data differently, to have different conversations before launching research projects, to consider how we're accounting for equity issues, diversity issues, inclusion issues. And that is maybe the biggest challenge of all of that. I've talked more about technical challenges to date, but there are huge challenges in trying to do data differently and to meet different needs. So from there, I'm going to move on.
Next slide.
To the next slide. Thank you. So if you're using existing surveys for your data analysis, you're obviously limited by the questions that are asked. So for the examples I'm going to pull up today, we're talking about Statistics Canada's General Social Survey, where the question about sex was actually a binary question of women and men, where there were only two options in that question. There were no other genders that were possible to be selected or written into that question. And there was a question about Aboriginal respondents, the more common term now, the more accepted term now, we believe, is Indigenous respondents. A question about racialized respondents that included visible minority, and I'm happy to hear that Mark is working with StatsCan to improve the language around that, because we found that their language has become dated to some extent. So we did take a look at a range of different factors in our demographic analysis of arts participation, and the link is there at the bottom. And I will mention also that I will post the findings, post my presentation on my website when I have a moment later today. So it'll be in the presentation section so that you can download it and follow the links and find out the information at your leisure. So yes, next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the things we did with our arts participation analysis is we took a segment of the age group. We looked at Canadian youth, and we did an infographic based on Canadian youth. And we found actually that Canadian youth are avid arts participants. And this counters some of the prevailing thought that maybe younger people don't necessarily participate in the arts in quite the same way. You can see the purple bars on the left are generally larger than the teal bars on the right. So the purple bars on the left being the youth participation rates in a variety of different arts activities, and the Canadian averages on the right. I will move on, please. Another example in our arts participation research is taking a look at the intersectional analysis of making or performing art, active arts participation. We looked at some of the simple factors, such as women being more active in this way than men. There's similarities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous respondents and racialized and non-racialized respondents. But then we dug a bit deeper and looked intersectionally at racialized and non-racialized women, at immigrant and non-immigrant women, at women in different family income groups, at racialized or non-racialized immigrants, and at racialized or non-racialized non-immigrants as well. So we found some differences between subgroups of the population there, and just wanted to to start delving into the that kind of intersectional look at things to see what we would find. And we did find some differences there. And some of them don't follow necessarily the overall trends. So we were able to do this because the data were based on a very large data set. 9,844 people responded to this survey. So we were able to pursue it in great depth. We did mostly look at the percentage of people attending or participating at least once during the year. So it's a pretty simple statistic in that sense from an arts participation standpoint. And I just wanted to note that in the same survey, there were some questions related to health and well-being. And that moves me on to my next point. What that did, the next slide, sorry, is that what that allowed us is to analyze health and well-being and related to arts participation. So what we did is we looked at 4 aspects of health and well-being: self-reported health, self-reported mental health, relatively strong satisfaction with life, and relatively strong satisfaction with feeling part of a community. And to some extent, those are indicators of convenience. They're good indicators of health and well-being, we think, but they are ones that actually happen to be available to us in the same data set as the arts participation data. So because they were asked in the same data set, we were able to correlate those two sets of data. And we actually pursued 3 elements in the analysis of arts participation, health and well-being, just an observation of differences in health and well-being for arts participants and non-participants. We also looked at the cultural participation index, where we looked at all of the 28 questions related to arts and culture. We gave each one a score and saw that people who attended multiple different things, whether or not they had higher levels of health and mental health, for example. And we also did some statistical modeling for you stats geeks out there, so a regression analysis with an analysis between the 7 arts activities, health, and well-being. So what did we find? Some of these simpler results is that when we looked at all 15 arts, culture, and heritage activities, that people who participated or attended had higher self-reported health and higher self-reported mental health, in this case, on this infographic, than people who did not participate. So we pulled out some examples of that, those 15 activities: live music, book reading, cultural festivals, theater, comedy, art galleries, and showed the differences there. Kind of the simplistic view of things, the first stage of the analysis, really. And I'll move on to the next slide, please. So what we also found is that for self-reported health, with the cultural participation index, we found that health did increase with higher levels of cultural participation pretty steadily. And in the statistical modeling that we did, we found that 6 arts activities were each associated with very good or excellent health. Sorry, that's a typo there. It should just say health, after accounting for 15 socioeconomic factors. And I've just listed those, the 6 activities there. And for mental health, there was better mental health for people with moderate, high, and very high levels of cultural participation. So there was an increase. It was not a steady increase as it was for health, but it was a kind of an increase from the low to medium levels and then stayed pretty stable at a higher level on the index for those who participated more. And in statistical modeling, we found that 3 activities, live music, live theater or comedy, and book reading, were associated with very good or excellent mental health after accounting for 15 socioeconomic factors, which is what we do in the statistical models that we do. So thank you very much. That's the amount that I wanted to present today. And I just wanted to put in a quick plug for a new/renewed initiative that we'll be announcing and talking about more in the coming months. It's called Arts Insights Canada, where we are actually starting to try to do data differently. And it's funded by 3 leading foundations in the arts in Canada.
Thanks so much, Kelly, and thank you for being heroic and making it through the slide crisis. A couple of questions coming from chat for you. I let people know that your report's available on the Hill Strategy site, but also
Yes.
A question about what's the age parameters for youth? How are you defining youth?
In that case, it was 15 to 24, which was the lowest age range. That survey was available for people 15 and older. So we took the first 10-year age range, which was 15 to 24-year-olds, and called that youth in that case.
And then what's the comparative average that you use for that data?
The comparative average was just the national Canadian average. So it was the average for all age groups.
And what is that like? So it wasn't
different
a
for
mean.
each indicator.
It wasn't a
because
median. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So it's the average. So for making a performing art, I mentioned that the 50% of Canadians made or performed art in some way. So that is the Canadian average. And among youth, that average was higher. I can't remember if it was 60% or above, but it was something in that ballpark. So we took the average among the youth contingent and then the overall Canadian average and showed where there are differences between those two.
So hopefully we'll come back. I have a series of questions to you. I mean, one thing that was very striking is, that there's counterintuitive data that, you were able to find in terms of arts participation, in terms of, race and a kind of intersectional analysis. So I think it's why this kind of analysis is so important, because we have assumptions that they can be disproved through the analysis of this large kind of data set. So Ted Hewitt, over to you. Looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Good day to everybody. Bonjour. Avant de commencer, je vais indiquer que je vais parler en anglais.
Before I speak, I'll indicate that I'll be speaking in English. I'll be making my presentation in English, but welcome your questions in French as well afterwards.
Funds research in social sciences and humanities. Obviously, we've been very much involved in the funding, at least, the collection and analysis of data, big data, demographic data, qualitative data, particularly in the social sciences, but also increasingly in the humanities. And maybe less well known is that not only do we fund this research, we're also deeply involved in making data available and ensuring its continued use really beyond immediate projects. So, for example, with respect to making data available, some of you will know that since 2005, we've funded the Canadian Research Data Centers Network, which is a joint initiative between SSHRC and CIHR with close collaboration from Statistics Canada, which provides access to confidential data to researchers in secure facilities on a number of campuses now across Canada. And this is now one of the 17 major science initiatives that are currently funded in the country. And to help ensure that data are shared, we've just announced the implementation of the Tri-Council Research Data Management Policy. And the intent of the policy is really to help institutions and researchers ensure their data is properly managed, properly stored, that it's retrievable in archives, recognized archives and repositories. We're not quite in the era of open data, but at least we're in a much better position than we have ever been to ensure that data are protected for future use across all disciplines. I think our current and our next challenge is going to be how to better support researchers undertaking more novel projects using data, and there are plenty of these emerging across the entire research spectrum. One really great example is some work that's being undertaken by a SSHRC-funded researcher and computer scientist, actually, Marke Daly, who's actually now at CFAR, was from Western University, currently on leave. His work has focused on Gregorian chants and has helped enable researchers to capture and analyze medieval chants and even to teach machines to make and to mimic music. Incredible stuff. I mean, we tried to support this kind of innovation more systematically through our involvement in a major international consortium called Digging into Data, some of you may be aware of, now spans over a dozen funding agencies in Europe and the Americas as part of the transatlantic platform. And what makes Digging into Data really, really unique is that it not only supports research projects per se, projects that use data to explore novel topics, also, it looks at supporting research that explores new ways of using data, particularly big data. So I'll give you an example. One is called the Mummies Project. It actually stands for something, but I don't have all the content. It's a Canada-U.S. collaboration designed to provide mummy and medical researchers with a large-scale comparative database of medical imaging of mummified human remains. And this is a real departure if you know anything about the study of mummies, because for the most part, this has been a case-based type of approach. Now it's moving towards large-scale comparative epidemiological research, and that's going to allow researchers to learn more about the health of the specimens while they were alive, their diet, their longevity, their cause of death, and so forth, to tell us more about how ancient Egyptians lived. There's another project I wanted to mention that looks at the social and psychological mechanisms of self-organized collaboration, which we do a lot, focusing on the open collaborative software development platform GitHub. So the team applies a computational model of human interaction that makes explicit predictions about online interactions in a collaborative group based on the notion that group members hold identities that are learnable, mathematically describable, and complementary to those of other group members. A few other projects I wanted to mention as well that we fund outside this project are really quite interesting for their implications on governance and on social justice. So, for example, we have a major SSHRC-funded project led out of the Université de Montréal called Autonomy Through Cyber Justice Technology, and that really brings together a large team representing the world's leading research centers on the implementation and use of technologies in the field of justice, litigants, and legal professionals, and the main users and purveyors of artificial intelligence for justice in Canada, in order to show how AI can be used to prevent and resolve conflicts to the benefit of justice stakeholders and access to justice. We also have funded something called the Big Data Surveillance Project, should be of interest to all of us, led from Queens, which focuses on vulnerabilities generated by big data surveillance and how they relate to social, political, and ethical issues in areas of security, marketing, and governance. And finally, at the University of Manitoba, a project called Across the Spectrum is set to enhance existing research capacity for conducting social policy research and evaluation using big data to conduct applied research and evaluation on existing social services, programs, and policies. The program's stated goal is to use the power of data to address the most pressing social challenges and wicked problems facing governments in the 21st century. And really, these are just a few. The challenge for us, as I've said at SSHRC, is making sure we understand the kinds of data and infrastructure needs that will continue to drive this research. And we're working to do that not only through Canada's new digital research infrastructure organization, affectionately known as ENDRIO, and our work with them, but also our own research to better understand the particular needs of research in the social sciences and humanities. So certainly participating in events like this, based on what I've heard already from my esteemed colleagues, is really important as well. And I'm really looking forward to learning more through the discussion in the next few minutes in the time that we have left. So thanks a lot, Sara, for the opportunity to be able to present today.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. It's very exciting to see the field of digital humanities and digital social science really explode, and it's such a global field. It's fantastic. I'm going to just ask each of you a specific question, and then we'll see if there's anything coming to us from the chat. So, Mark, you said you had a few case studies you wanted to share with us of the ways that Heritage is involved with looking at audience and audience analysis, and maybe you could share those with us now. I know that you, when we prepared for this panel, there was some really exciting work that's currently at play.
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't want to take too much time in the little that remains, but I can give one example. The culture satellite account, which is something that we've been building for the last number of years with Statistics Canada, is a way really to measure the economic importance of culture in Canada, not because Canadian Heritage thinks the economic importance of culture is the most important part. I think most people agree that the intangibles are kind of where the greatest impact lies. But when people talk about how much does culture contribute to GDP or to jobs, or how much does it contribute to the Canadian economy, in the past, we weren't able to say that in a succinct way because culture was scattered all across the macroeconomic accounts at Statistics Canada, because culture has a lot of different, subcomponents. So we created a definition of what's included and not included in culture, the Canadian Framework for Culture Statistics, and then that was operationalized, and all those cultural pieces were put into one place called the Culture Satellite Account at Statistics Canada, which lets us now, when we have questions and we want to build out and have a sense of what's going on in the culture economy, we can go there, and it's a systematic way to kind of look at what's happening in the economy. Recently, and over the last number of years, more and more, I mean, we've built out a number of modules off of that now. So we can look at economic impact, or we could look at trade, or we can do a number of different things there. But now more and more we realize we need to build out the human resource module, which will go and take data from the census and from Canada Revenue Agency data and other data, LFS and that sort of things, to be able to let us know, what's the contribution of Indigenous creators to this cultural economy, or what's the contribution of racialized communities. Because currently we don't have that with the data that we have in the Culture Satellite account, but more and more it kind of just shows that that's the kind of information that we can't do without. So across all of the work that we're doing, really, that capacity to be able to say how things differ across different, areas in the country, or people with different levels of ability or disability, or from, different equity-seeking communities is extremely important to us.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to remind our participants in the audience to put your questions into chat. Alexis will bring them forward to us, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. But before we go there, Kelly, again, when we were preparing for this session, we talked a little bit about your wisdom to those in the audience about collecting their own data, and maybe how that collection intersects with these sorts of large data sets that you're so expert at working with. Words of wisdom. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I was on mute, and I apologize.
Hard to give words of wisdom on mute.
That's what my words of wisdom were worth, I guess, today. So I would just say, take some time, be careful about it, look into what others have done in the same kind of sphere if you are doing your own survey, and then just try to give people as many open options as possible, and as many kind of select all options as possible, because pigeonholing people's identities into one checkbox, even if there are multiple questions about, say, demographics, that can be often very challenging. So in a lot of our surveys, we've used select all options for gender options, for sexual identity, etc. So, and those are seen as the most inclusive and appropriate options, I believe, still. I will say also that things do change over time. So I mentioned a lit review that we wrote 3 or 4 years ago. There could be developments that might have been newer even than that, because the inclusive terminology is changing. So it is not that makes it even more challenging for all of us in the sector to try to do solid work in this area, because the inclusive terminology does change, and we have to try to keep up with that.
So maybe I'll push that a little bit. I spent the last couple of weeks participating in a digital humanities conference that was funded by SSHRC called Project Endings. You can just imagine some of the topics, but one of the things that we were looking at were these sorts of questions around ontology creation, and how you create continuity with large databases and even archives that are described in one way in the metadata and the terminology used, and then you have a lot of social change in these spaces. So how can we continue to be able to navigate these really, really valuable databases when the terms we use and our understanding change, and hence the searches no longer are meaningful maybe to contemporary users? And then I've got a great question from the audience that I'll go to.
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult challenge in terms of benchmarking to other surveys or keeping continuity with the past. There are often breakages, even in StatsCan data sets, where the surveys are similar over time, at least somewhat similar. There are changes that mean that you can't necessarily compare back historically, and that in itself is a problem. So there could be some touchstone questions that you would be able to ask in the same way as other benchmarks that you might want to benchmark yourself against. But I guess that's another part of the research project process in terms of preparing your project, so that you would be able to, you should know what you really want to benchmark against and with, and if there are some benchmark surveys that you want to touch base with and cross over with, then you might have to modify how you ask your questions and not ask it in the ideal way for you, but in a way that is similar enough to the benchmark survey. But that is a challenge.
Thank you for that. We have a good question here in the chat from Frédéric Julien. À mon avis, les données démographiques, autant celles du STACAN que
regarding demographic data,
sur la participation
regarding the cultural participation
underused.
and the way they are underused.
Occasionnellement, des présentations sur les recherches de la regard statistique. De quelle autre façon peut-on
In which other way can we encourage a better use of the existing data?
Maybe, Mark, do you want to take that? Kelly, Ted, and then we've got to get out of here because I realize that we're going over time and I need to give our participants some good exit advice. Mark, over to you.
Oui, je sais pas comment dire ça rapidement, mais en gros, je suis d'accord.
I don't know how to say that quickly, but I agree with you, Frédéric. There are many data that we're not using. We should do better. I think that at the department level we use much, but it's not always shared with the outside. So one first thing is to share it with the outside.
Use what is already there enough, and there's been a call for more disaggregated data when there is actually quite a bit of disaggregated data. Statistics Canada has a new action plan for disaggregated data, so maybe that will help as well. But I think part of it is we do have things internally that we don't necessarily share as well as we could externally, and that's definitely part of it.
Kelly.
I agree with Mark. We're all in some way working to build a data culture in the arts. And I think we're taking baby steps in that direction. But I think pushing the sector further with discussions like we're having today to use that kind of data and to integrate data thinking and data insights into their day-to-day activities. I think that's something that we all want to do. And one of the ways that we're moving forward, we're trying to do that is by incorporating diverse panels of people to work with us on different projects, so that we might be able to have input from different communities and then have more on the end results. Have the end results diffusé. I've got the French in my mind. Thank you, Frédéric. Gotten back out into those communities in better ways. Reaching those communities in better ways.
Thanks. Ted, any comment here?
Oui, juste pour dire que le SSHRC encourage beaucoup l'utilisation.
We encourage a lot the use of Stats Canada data, and that's why we have a partnership with them, and we've established and we finance the National Network for Data Analysis, also with Stats Canada, and
Partout ici au Canada.
we participate in everywhere.
Unfortunately, we're actually out of time, and now the questions are coming in. But I encourage people to stay with us and come to some of the other sessions. There's a session coming up tomorrow that's looking at survey strategy and sociodemographic data. What is up next are the panel on Visualize the Unexpected and a couple of other workshops you can register to, Making Sense of Your Data and the Data Informed website. Thank you very much. Please tell us, there's a survey that you can take. Please take that survey. It's currently in the chat. And thank you very much for joining us. And we'll see you. Thank you to my fabulous panelists and great conversation. And let us dig into that data and help to change the world and make it a better place.
Okay,
Bye,
merci,
everybody.
collègues.
Merci.
See you soon.